Welcome back for another Shifu lecture from the Naval Academy Museum. And with us today is our guest, Steve Phillips. He's a Naval Academy class of 1992. He is a retired commander in the United States Navy Reserve, EOD. He is a two-time author, having published 2 novels. And Steve is also one of our non-resident fellows. And Steve is going to be here today to talk to us about the history of the United States Naval Academy during the Civil War. And Steve, over to you.
Thank you, Claude. This year marks the 175th anniversary of the founding of the U.S. Naval Academy. And thankfully, the museum has granted me an opportunity to conduct research both at the museum and Nimitz Library in order to share with you an important story of an interesting period in Naval Academy history, the Civil War. In summary, the Naval Academy moved to Fort Adams in Newport, Rhode Island during the Civil War under the leadership of Commodore George Blake, the superintendent. Blake led the Academy through the entire war period to include its return to Annapolis. Today, I will tell the story of the Academy from the fall of 1860 through its return in 1865 with a mosaic of original source material. Thus, my emphasis is not on the political events of the time, the overall war itself. Rather, I want to share with you the voices of midshipmen, staff, and the Secretary of the Navy during this period. It's important to discuss my source material. I started my research with a few books. Examples include Society of Gentlemen by Mark Hunter, The Spirited Years by Charles Todorich, and the U.S. Naval Academy, An Illustrated History by Jack Sweetman. But then I delved into original source material to include letters from midshipmen, like this one, written while sailing to Newport aboard USS Constitution. Memoirs of midshipmen and naval officers, like this piece by John Pegram, and documents such as this letter from the Atlantic House in Newport. I must give thanks to Sandra Duplantis, the educational specialist at the Naval Academy Museum, and Sam Limnios of the Nimitz Library Special Collections. My research journey benefited greatly from their enthusiastic support. These men are some of the original sources you will hear from today. From left to right, they are Gideon Wells, the Secretary of the Navy, Commodore George Blake, Superintendent of the Naval Academy, Rear Admiral Bowman Henry McCalla, class of 1865, and Captain Oliver Ambrose Batchelor, class of 1863. I wish there was time to tell the stories of every original source that I had the opportunity to review, but instead I'm going to delve into 2 of these in a little bit more detail to serve as exemplars. But the audience should know that there are more original sources than these 4 men. George Blake was from Worcester, Massachusetts. He was the first superintendent from a northern state. He served in that role from 1857 until 1865, a total of 8 years. He is the longest serving Naval Academy superintendent. During his tenure there, he sought to encourage midshipmen with positive reinforcement. He created command positions within the student body. He had stars placed on the academic register next to midshipmen's names for academic achievement, and that led to the stars that are now worn on the uniform today. He began the tradition of presenting a sword to a distinguished graduate. So it's interesting, all of these, of his positive reinforcements, they all remain today. But of course, what's most significant is that he led the Naval Academy through the tumultuous times of the Civil War to include the move to and return from Newport, Rhode Island. Before discussing this gentleman, Rear Admiral Bowman McCalla, a note about Naval Academy classes. During this time, Classes were referred to by the date of entry because individual midshipmen often graduated in less than 4 years. In my notations, the year of entry is listed first and in parentheses. Later, it became more common to adopt the collegiate practice of identifying the graduating year, which was assigned retroactively in some literature. This is the second year listed. McCalla's memoirs are in Nimitz special collections. I don't quote directly from McCalla, as I will others during this discussion, but he does receive mention, and much of his writings support my knowledge of the Naval Academy in Newport during the Civil War. McCalla's academy experience was certainly unique. After the South seceded, additional appointments were made from northern states to make up for the lack of students in the student body from those southern states. Congressman Nixon of New Jersey gave McCalla one of these appointments. He arrived in Newport after the school year was already underway in November of 1861. McCalla must have been studious. After exams in February of 1862, he was in the top 50 of his class in standing. So he was placed in a group known as the Advanced Midshipman Fourth Class. From this point forward, there were Advanced Third Class, Advanced Fourth Class, and Fourth Class. McCalla eventually graduates within the top 5 of his class in November of 1864. He later served as an instructor at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, but like the rest of the class of 1865, his entire experience of the Naval Academy as a midshipman was in Newport, Rhode Island. After reviewing what others have written and original source material, it becomes clear that the major phases of the Civil War Naval Academy can be described as secession, defense of the Academy, move and establishment in Newport, Rhode Island, life in Newport, and return. There's several important milestones that must be highlighted. In the winter of 1860, following Lincoln's election, midshipmen from the southern states began to resign. In the spring of 1861, secessionists in Maryland threatened Union soldiers, the U.S. Naval Academy, and the USS Constitution. On the 24th of April, 1861, the last formation occurs pierside prior to the midshipmen embarking Constitution for the trip to Newport. This is also the moment when the last of midshipmen from southern states resign. On the 27th, Constitution sailed for Newport, and she arrived on the 10th of May, 1861. In May, first class midshipmen and second class they're graduated, and then second class and third class midshipmen are sent to the fleet to serve as acting midshipmen. From May of 1861 then until September of 1865, the Naval Academy is in Newport, and it returns in September of 1865 to Annapolis. Starting in the winter of 1860, after Lincoln's election, the tension within the country is also felt inside the Naval Academy. This sentiment is reflected in a letter written home by Midshipman Ambrose Batchelor. He's pictured here as a lieutenant. The letter was written in the spring of 1861, quote, "It would be much more pleasant if we could have this academy upon northern soil, as the military academy is, where we could be near those who think and feel as we do, and where we might speak our minds without fear of wounding the delicate feelings of those who live by the institution of slavery." The first midshipmen to resign were from South Carolina. They all resigned en masse when their state voted to secede on December 20th, 1860. Midshipman John Pegram of Rhode Island describes the resignations in his memoirs, which can be found online. He said, quote, "Toward the early spring of 1861, one after another of the Southern acting midshipmen sometimes several at a time, resigned by permission of their parents and went south. After the semi-annual examination in February 1861, quite a number resigned who were permitted to do so by the Navy Department in order to escape dismissal in consequence of failure to pass the examination, and some of these went south. Finally, when Fort Sumter was attacked and surrendered, there was quite a flight southward, unquote. So exactly how many midshipmen resigned after Lincoln's election? The answer can vary depending on the source. What is clear is that some resigned as their state seceded, others after the completion of exams. Then there were a number of resignations just before the midshipmen embarked Constitution for the trip to Newport. But what's most important to note is that most midshipmen from the southern states eventually resigned. I think perhaps Mark Hunter's record that shows all but 17 southern midshipmen resigned serves as a quotable figure. The midshipman that's pictured here is Joseph David Wilson of the Confederate Navy. Originally from the U.S. Naval Academy class of 1861, he resigned on April 17, 1861, without graduation, and he was commissioned an acting midshipman in the Confederate Navy on the same day. I've mentioned Constitution a number of times. In the fall of 1860, the Constitution arrived at the Naval Academy to serve as the training ship. Lieutenant George Rogers was commanding. His brother Christopher was the commandant of midshipmen, and George would later relieve his brother in that role. The incoming freshmen, midshipmen fourth class, at the time they were called plebs, they were housed aboard the ship. They were divided into gun crews of 16 men and a powder boy, led by an elected captain. Each crew had a gun, a study room, a mess table, a boat, a rack of muskets and cutlasses, and hooks to hang up their hammocks for sleep at night. The gun deck was used for recitation, study, and class formations, and the berthing deck was both the mess decks and the dormitory. Now, many expected Maryland to secede. Both the Naval Academy grounds and the Constitution were threatened. Commodore Blake sent Lieutenant Stephen Luce to Washington to express concern and seek permission to move. Mobs gathered outside the academy and jeered and threw rocks at the midshipmen, who responded in kind. Midshipmen were assigned at one point to the northern shore of the Severn River to support defense of the yard. And on at least one occasion, boats on the Severn River at night were perceived as a pending attack. The academy, to include the midshipmen, was on a war footing. There were times that they thought that they'd be attacked, and the mids responded to calls to arms. Batchelor wrote home about this, which must have been an exciting moment in Naval Academy history. He wrote, quote, "Hastily dressing myself, I repaired to the armory, where I found a crowd arming themselves, and followed their example, was soon armed in the following style: a revolver in my belt, a broadsword at my side, and a musket on my shoulder, quite ready to travel around the yard for 8 hours, if nothing more." Concerned that secessionists would attempt to capture the Constitution, Superintendent George Blake directed guns and ammunition from Fort Severn to be transferred aboard. Midshipmen gun crews stood security watch to protect the ship from attack. The ship got underway, and it ran aground in the Severn. But after some kedging and warping, she was able to get underway again and was moored in Annapolis roads. On the 19th of April, 1861, a unit from Massachusetts was attacked by secessionists in Baltimore. Both soldiers and civilians were killed. General Butler of the 8th Massachusetts, which was also heading to the south, then commandeered a ship at Perryville, Maryland, and sailed that to the Naval Academy to avoid Baltimore. When he arrived, he told Commodore Blake, "I'm here to defend the Constitution." This created some confusion because Blake thought he actually meant the ship, And Butler was talking about the nation, and thus the government document, sort of in the generic sense. Blake gets permission to depart, and on the 24th of April, the Naval Academy has its last formation before boarding Constitution. Captain Rogers pointed to the flag, and it was a very emotional moment as he said, "My boys, stand by the old flag." After that, he was reported to have broken down and wept. There were tearful goodbyes between midshipmen. Some were greeted with, or said goodbyes with handshakes or slapped on the back. And it was at this point that the last midshipman from the southern states departed. Even faculty members argued about resignation. Lieutenants Foxhall and William Parker, brothers, who were both instructors at the academy, argued over the decision to resign. The Parker family had been in Virginia since 1650, so like other Americans at the time, their heritage preceded the creation of the United States. But they were also from a Navy family. Their father had even commanded the Constitution for a short time. William Wright said that they must remain loyal to the nation and to the Navy. Foxhall, on the left, asserted that the ties to the family and to the state came first. Each of them presented such a persuasive argument that both changed their minds. Foxhall would later serve as superintendent of the Naval Academy, and he's the only one to die while in that office. William resigned from the Navy during this, his third tour as an instructor at the Naval Academy. He served first in Virginia's State Navy, then in the Confederate Navy, and he became the superintendent of the Confederate Naval Academy. After the war, William served as president of the University of Maryland. One of his predecessors was Franklin Buchanan, who was the U.S. Naval Academy's first superintendent. On April 27, 1861, Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles sent this letter to Captain Blake authorizing the move to Newport, Rhode Island. Here is the log from the USS Constitution on the morning of April 27, 1861. Note the remark on the top right where it says, "at sea," and the recording of speed and course starting at 9 a.m. in the columns on the left. The log reads that Constitution was bound for New York. It lists the sails that were set. And near the bottom it says, there's a comment that says at 8 p.m. they were past Cape Henry Light at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. After arriving in Newport, the three Upperclass were detached for war. These departures are recorded in the Constitution's decalogue that day that she arrived in Newport. Quote, 10th of May, 1861, from 4 to 8 p.m., light and calm with pursuing clouds. Lieutenants Upshur and Matthews were detached by order of Secretary of the Navy. The following acting midshipmen of the first and second classes were detached and also ordered to the following places: Phoenix, Rogers, Davenport, Phillips, Owen, Sampson, Graham, and Mitchell. These men detached as acting midshipmen, and I've not found any record of them being commissioned later on, but they never returned to the Naval Academy. Of note, Lieutenant Henry Upshur mentioned here is the nephew of Captain George Upshur, the second superintendent who the road on the Naval Academy grounds is named for. Shortly after its arrival in Newport, the Constitution becomes an attraction. The public is able to tour the ship, and the ladies of Newport join midshipmen on board for dances and other social events. The Navy then rents a hotel named Atlantic House to berth midshipmen and faculty. On the 21st of September, 1861, the third class move ashore and into the hotel. There's no athletics during this period of time, but the midshipmen do practice fencing and bayonet drills. Here are the letters from Nimitz Special Collection of the Atlantic House being turned over to the U.S. Navy by William Newton, and then returned and accepted by the administrator of his estate, E.F. Newton. What Blake did not sign is the bill for the damages to the Atlantic House. There was over $1,000 in damages to the estate of the late William Newton. These were endorsed by Admiral David Porter, Blake's successor. There's no word on whether the damages inflicted by the midshipmen had an impact on William Newton's demise. In the fall of 1861, 25 members of the class of 60, remember from their entry date, they're authorized to complete the curriculum in 3 years vice 4 through additional recitations. These become the advanced third class. Again, there was no Southern applicants for the class of 1861, so the Northern states are given additional appointments. And some of these are made after the academic year begins. I must introduce another original source that's not been previously mentioned in order to tell his story. Rear Admiral Robley Evans grew up in Virginia, but his family moved west, and he is the first Service Academy appointee from the territory of Utah, showing how the conflict separated families. Evans' mother submits his resignation to the Navy Department, which he then has to later reverse. But his younger brother joins the Confederate Army. In September of 1862, he was on leave at a family home in Washington, D.C. It was being maintained by a single maid in the family's absence. He went to a local seafood bar for oysters, and there he encountered his brother. Evans writes of this event in his memoir called A Sailor's Log. Quote, "I went to an oyster house with a friend to eat some raw oysters," and then he sees his brother. He drank up his glass of beer and then walked briskly out of the place, while I called for oysters on the half shell and ate them very slowly. I reported that there was a rebel officer in the city, that I had seen and recognized him and knew him as such. As a result of this incident, I was twice arrested and taken before the provost marshal on suspicion of holding intercourse with the rebels. Because many in the nation had such familial ties, the Navy was vigilant in observing the statements made by midshipmen and what it implied with respect to their loyalty. In this letter, written in July of 1861, we see that Gideon Welles, Secretary of the Navy, challenges the loyalty of a single midshipman, John Pegram, from the class of 1864. Remember that I read from Pegram's memoirs earlier. Welles emphasizes that the loyalty must be first to the United States and not the state of origin, and suggests that the superintendent, Commodore Blake, must impress this upon the rest of the midshipmen. With the help of special collections in Nimitz Library, I was able to read Welles' personal letter to the midshipmen upon receiving Pegram's statement of loyalty merely 10 days after the letter that he wrote to Blake. It says, quote, "Your letter of the 15th of July, forwarded by the superintendent under the date of the 16th, has been received. From your profession of loyalty to the country and the presentations of the superintendent to that effect, the department is satisfied with your statement, and as requested by you, returning here with your letter to the late acting midshipman O. A. Brown. Respectfully yours, Secretary Gideon Welles." So somehow Pegram's letter to a friend in one of the classes ahead of him was intercepted and opened, but then subsequently returned to Pegram, perhaps to survive as a memento of their friendship. But Welles' use of the word late to imply a death here was perhaps a personal jab or some sort of message to Pegram, because Horace Applewhite Brown was a midshipman who resigned from the U.S. Navy and was serving aboard the Confederate ship Shenandoah. Shenandoah, in fact, was the last bastion of the Confederacy, which surrendered after pulling into Liverpool, England on November 6, 1865, 7 months after Lincoln's assassination. So Wells may have been saying to Pegram, in effect, Brown is dead to me, and he should be dead to you too. With such matters settled, hosting tours and balls and reaffirming everyone's loyalty, by the summer of 1862, the Academy was operating well in Newport, and the midshipmen began a summer cruise that would take them into Confederate territory. The cruise that summer was divided into 3 blocks aboard USS John Adams. The first block sailed to Fort Monroe, Virginia, and the midshipmen toured McClellan's defensive works there. They then sailed to Port Royal, South Carolina, and they visited USS Wabash, which was a new steam frigate. The midshipmen were hosted aboard Wabash for the Independence Day celebration. The painting or pencil drawing here depicts Wabash. You can see the stack in the center of the ship, though I wonder if the emissions would trail in the opposite direction of the wind. Preparations were made for Confederate attacks in Newport, just as they had been done at the Naval Academy and the Naval Academy in Annapolis. And the Academy sought to engage Confederate vessels whenever they were operating in northern waters. But during that period of time, they never met the Confederates at sea. This letter from Edward Simpson, the Commandant at the time, describes preparations to Commodore Blake. He said, quote, 3 crews of midshipmen from the school ship Constitution have been stationed and exercises at the firing battery on Goat Island, which commands the channel from seaward. 1 crew of midshipmen has been stationed and exercised at the Parrott gun, mounted on the forecastle of the Santee, which commands the approach of the breakwater. He continues, should an enemy succeed in getting inside the breakwater, preparations have been made for repelling boarders and muskets kept loaded on board all of the vessels of the squadron. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, E. Simpson, Commandant of Midshipmen. I suspect that the generations that were in Newport and in Annapolis at this time are the only midshipmen that ever had to prepare for boarders. It's interesting to summarize then the year 1864 in Newport. By this time, the school is operating at full steam, and that's a pun. Several midshipmen from the class of 1865, including McCalla, complete their examinations in June of 1864, and they anticipate graduation, that they've met all the requirements. But instead, they're told that they have to sail on another summer cruise for more lessons in steam engineering, navigation, and international law aboard the USS Marblehead. There are reports that the Confederate ship Tallahassee is operating in northern waters, and that leads to Marblehead getting underway to try to find and engage her. During that time, McCalla is assigned as the assistant engineer. After they return, all of the midshipmen have to stand engineering watch positions aboard Marblehead under the scrutiny of Benjamin Franklin Isherwood, head of the Bureau of Steam Engineering. So in effect, he was observing them and quizzing them and testing them, probably not unlike what Admiral Rickover would have done. McCalla and 32 members of the class of 1865 then graduate on the 30th of November, 1864. McCalla ranks 4th in the class when he graduates. Unbeknownst to the faculty and staff, this would be their last full year in Newport. The school would soon return to Annapolis. And in fact, the last of McCalla's classmates graduate in June 1865 after 4 years. Thus, the class of 1865 is the Newport class, having never spent a day in Annapolis as midshipmen. So I've already relayed about the transfer of the Atlantic House back to its rightful owners. So the last thing to share is commentary about the leadership that took the Naval Academy through our nation's most perilous time. Secretary of the Navy Gideon Wells wrote the following letter of praise to Commodore Blake. Quote, in relieving you from the important position of Superintendent of the Naval Academy, which you have conducted with ability and zeal for the last 8 years, the department takes occasion to express to you its acknowledgement of your valuable service, which, though rendered in the more quiet walks of the profession, have, during an excited and interesting period, been recognized and appreciated. He continues, the removal of the Academy from Annapolis to Newport, which was effected under your superintendence, and the final termination of the school at the latter place have been events of importance in the history of the institution, and with them your name and services are honorably identified. In retiring from the position which you have so long occupied with distinction, I tender you the respectful regards of the department. Commodore George Blake was the longest serving superintendent. He led the Naval Academy through the Civil War to include moving it to Newport, Rhode Island and back again. Today, he's recognized on the Naval Academy grounds with the road that is in front of the superintendent's house, the chapel, and the superintendent's office. Thus, the Academy's address, 121 Blake Road, gives him some recognition. For his longstanding legacy of positive leadership that remains within the brigade today, and his leadership that ensured it endured the Civil War, I suggest that perhaps additional recognition is warranted. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and I look forward to further questions from folks, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know how else to end it, Claude.
That's great. No, thanks, Steve. I appreciate it. And for everybody who's watched this, thanks for joining us for another online SHIFU lecture. We hope I guess we'll be doing this again next semester. And but if you have questions for Steve, send them to the Naval Academy Museum, and we'll forward those to him to answer to you. All right. Thanks, everybody, and I hope you have a great day.